So welcome to this introduction to Microsoft Azure Infrastructure as a Service. And really my goal for this session is to dive into some of the basics around creating a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure IaaS, but also there's been a bit of confusion about the networking side. So how do I connect to my virtual machines? What difference does it make if I add a VPN between Azure and my on-premises? So I just want to dive into that a little bit. Now, the first thing is actually creating a virtual machine. So many of you may have seen sort of the Azure portal, but I'm just going to quickly go through creating a virtual machine so you can see some of the options. So if I kind of go to my new option, virtual machine, I can create a VM from the gallery. And it's going to give me a list of images. So there's Windows images, there's SharePoint images, there's SQL images, but I select the image I want to install. So I can just say Windows 2012 R2, and then I'm going to go to the next page. I can then select the patch version I want. So I'll go to the latest patch. I give the VM a name. So I might just call this test VM. I select the tier. So this is around load balancing type capabilities. I pay a bit less if I do a basic tier compared to the standard tier. I select the size. So the size relates to the amount of memory, the amount of CPU cores, but also the amount of additional disks I can add to it for data drives. So I'm just going to say a 2-core, 3.5 gigs of memory. I have to give it a local username. So I'm just going to say local admin. Then I have to give it a complex password for this account. So I'll just create a password. And then I go to the next screen. And this is kind of the interesting part. So I have to select a cloud service I'm going to use. So I say I want to create a new cloud service, and by default it will be the name of the virtual machine, or I can use an existing cloud service. So I'm just going to use an existing cloud service. But if I hadn't have done that, if I'd have said create a new cloud service, I say, well, which region do I want to create it in? There's a lot of regions where I can go and create Azure services, and they're paired. So East US, West US, North US, South, Japan West, Japan East, etc. for resiliency of my data if I choose to do geo-replication. So I can select a region. I want to go and select my existing one. I can say where do I want the storage actually stored. So I have a storage account, so I can select my storage account. I can say if I want an availability set. I'm going to come back to what these mean. I can say don't worry about availability set. And you'll see there's endpoints created by default for remote desktop and PowerShell. So that's going to be enabled for me, so from the internet I can go through and RDP to my virtual machine. I can run PowerShell against it. And I can add my own ones. And then I can say I want the VM agent. So the VM agent is actually fairly new. IaaS, the point of this is Azure provides the storage, the compute, the network fabric. You own the VM. But the challenge was many people may be locking themselves out of the virtual machine. They wanted to reset the password, re-enable RDP, get some additional types of service. So there's now actually this VM agent, which is kind of a bridge between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. So if I enable that, I can now have additional extensions. I can have sort of malware type protection. I can get automation extensions through like Chef and Puppet and PowerShell design state configuration. Things like BG Info, the tool that gives you background information about your machine as your wallpaper. I can kind of inject that into it. So by default I'm going to have that VM agent. And then if I click this tick, it's going to go off and start creating that virtual machine. So that's really the process of creating a VM. But let's actually take a step back and look at some of those options. Let me just minimize this down. So the first thing is I selected a cloud service. So when I think about the cloud service, this is something I define in Azure. And I specify which region I want that cloud service to be in. And that could be the East US, West US, whatever. And that cloud service has something called a VIP, a virtual IP. And that VIP kind of sits out here. And that VIP is internet accessible. So if I have machines on the internet, they can connect to the cloud service through that VIP. So So I kind of have the internet out here. And I can access the cloud service via that VIP. So each cloud service has this unique IP address. Now inside the cloud service, I create my virtual machine. So I create my VM1, VM2, etc. Now those virtual machines have something called a DIP, a dynamic IP. And this DIP is internal to Azure. It's not accessible over the internet by default. And Azure decides which group of IP addresses it's going to use for each cloud service. I've no control over that. Now within the cloud service, those VMs can communicate via those DIPs. They can do local name resolution. So there is a name resolution service within the cloud service. But if I had another cloud service, same subscription, and I had VMs in here, they can't communicate. They can't do name resolution. They're completely isolated from one another. So let's forget about that for the time being. So we won't worry about that cloud service over there. So I have my cloud service with two VMs in it, and I want to be able to access them from the internet. I have this VIP for the cloud service. So those endpoints we created for the virtual machine are essentially mappings for when the VIP listens on a certain port. When it gets traffic on that port, it will forward it to that specific virtual machine that uses that endpoint. So it's kind of a direct mapping. So I listen on this port. When I get traffic on that port, I'm going to forward it to the virtual machine I've defined. And I can kind of see that. So if I look at an existing virtual machine I can see endpoints. And I have two. So you see I have a public port and I have a private port. So for like remote desktop, the public port is 61872. That's the port that cloud service VIP is listening on. So that's that public IP and the port. When it gets traffic on this port, the cloud service VIP, it will forward it to this port for this particular virtual machine. So it's doing that public RDP port. When it sees traffic, it forwards it to 3389 for VM1. There'll be a different public port for RDP for VM2. So it's just basically providing kind of a mapping table. So public port A goes to VM1, public port B goes to VM2, and it enables me to have that internet accessibility for my virtual machines in the cloud service. That's really all that's doing. And if I go ahead and look at, for example, a cloud service, I can see all the different endpoints it has defined. So I can see there's the public, there's the VIP for that cloud service, and then they're the endpoints that define for the various VMs in that cloud service. So that's what I see. So that's fine. Kind of makes sense. That gives me that mapping. But what about if I want more control? If I want to actually decide which IP addresses it's going to use inside that cloud service? If I want to be able to access the virtual machines from my on-premises without having to go through these endpoints? So I can create something called a virtual network. And when I create a virtual network, what I'm essentially doing, I'm defining my own IP space. So I tell Azure, I want you to use this IP space. So maybe I'm going to use 10.0.115/24. So 255.255.0. And I can break that up into virtual subnets. So I could create different subnets for domain controllers, for SQL servers, for static IP, whatever I want to do. So now what actually happens is, when I create VMs, and I create a new cloud service, I say, I want to create that VM on that virtual network, and specifically in this virtual subnet. So now the virtual machine will get an IP address. It's still dynamically assigned. I can never in Azure define a static IP address inside the virtual machine. It's always going to use DHCP. But I'm now telling Azure which address spaces to use to give to the VMs that's created in the cloud service. Now it has to be from the internet non-routable set, so it's the 10 dot, the 172, the 192.168. I can't use other ranges of IP address. It has to be from the internet non-routable. But I define that IP space I want to use. And I'm going to make sure I use a set that I do not use on premises. I don't want an overlap between what I do in Azure and what I'm going to do on premise. So now I create my cloud services. As part of this config, I can tell it DNS servers to use. So I could use a public DNS service, I could use my on-prem DNS servers, I could stand up a DC in here and use that for name resolution. So now what I can do, well, I can add different cloud services to the same virtual network. Well, now they can all communicate. They can all do name resolution between them. So now I'm crossing the boundary of that cloud service and they can communicate with each other through that virtual network. But I'm still accessing through this VIP. Each cloud service, so this one, would have its own VIP as well. So it has a separate VIP. Each cloud service has that virtual IP, that internet routable one. But using these internal IP addresses through the virtual network, they can communicate. So I want to take it a step further. And if you want, you can make sure VMs always get the same IP address, even if they're deprovisioned. Through PowerShell, I can say Azure Fabric, make sure you always give this VM this specific IP address. I can make sure this VIP of the cloud service is kept for me forever. I can reserve them in my subscription. Again, I can do all that through PowerShell. So my virtual network. So let's take it a step further. So we have our virtual network, and we have one or more cloud services in that virtual network that have our virtual machines inside them. And you have your on-premises as well. So this is your data center. And you've been very, very careful to make sure the IP scheme used here is not used in your data center. So they're not clashing. And I want to connect them together. So I can do a site-to-site VPN. So on my virtual network, I can figure I want to create a gateway. And then on my data center side, I kind of do exactly the same thing. I stand up a VPN, and the Azure virtual networking page will actually say, hey, what networking device do you have? And it can spit out a script for you. So it will actually go and help you configure your on-premises hardware, or I can use Windows 2012 RAS. So I configure this. This now gives me a site-to-site VPN. So these guys are actually now connected. And in terms of speed, I think it maxes out about 100 megabits per second. Because this is an IPsec tunnel going over the internet. So it's all encrypted, but it is going over the public internet. And basically on this end, on the Azure side, there's two VMs, an active and a passive, and they're one core each. And so that one core kind of maxes out doing all the IPsec calculations. So you get about 100 megabits per second. So now I have site-to-site connectivity. I have IP routing because they're using different sets of IP addresses, they're not overlapping, so they can route back and forth. So now this is a key point. If I'm in the data center here, and I'm accessing this VM, and I have a site-to-site VPN, I'm not using the cloud service VIP. I'm not using the endpoint. Because I have an IP connection directly from my data center through to that VM in the cloud, through the virtual network. So I'm not using the cloud service. I'm not going via this VIP. I'm not going over the internet. I'm using the site-to-site VPN connection through my IP routing directly into the VM, like it was a branch office in my network. I'm not going via this special endpoint. So I could turn all these endpoints off if I wanted to. If I didn't require any connectivity from the internet, I could actually just disable those endpoints completely. I don't need them. As soon as I have a site-to-site, I'm going over this connection. Now it is over the internet, but it's a VPN connection. Now, what was recently announced by TechEd 2014 is previously I can only have one VPN connection. What they announced is I can now have up to 10. So if I had maybe a DR data center, for example, I can also stand up a gateway there, and I can have another connection. Now there's still only one gateway on the Azure side. So I'm splitting this 100 megabits. I don't get 100 megs on each. I would get 50 here and 50 here, for example. But I can have up to 10. If I had different virtual networks, maybe I create multiple virtual networks with different cloud services in them, I can actually use that same gateway to actually go and connect different virtual networks together. So that's on the Azure backbone fabric, but it's still one of the 10, and it's still that 100 megabits per second shared bandwidth. So, but I can now connect virtual networks together directly through this site-to-site gateway. But again, none of this is through the cloud service VIP. This is all directly through now these IP connections. So that's a big deal. I'm not going over the public internet and those endpoints. I'm going directly through my IP routing. So this is kind of all you had. You had the ability to do a site-to-site VPN over the internet. But people kind of had concerns over that. It is the public internet. There's reliability concerns. There's maximum speeds I'm going to get over there. And so Microsoft announced ExpressRoute. And there's kind of two flavors of ExpressRoute. I've talked about this before. And really, just a quick summary, I have exactly the same thing. I have an Azure subscription. I have sort of my virtual network. I have my cloud service. I have my VMs. And I have my on-premises. And one of the flavors is I'm kind of going through an IXP. An internet exchange point, a network provider, an exchange provider. And these guys basically have big fat fiber connections into the Azure data center. You get all the big providers come into this thing, so they have a big connection to Azure. They have different racks and cases of servers, and they have redundant connectivity, different cages. So now me, as a client, maybe I have servers hosted at this facility, or I can have my own fiber connection added to that provider. So now I get direct connectivity to Azure. It's not over the public internet anymore. It's not an IPsec tunnel. It's a direct connection through. The other flavor is kind of that exact same picture again, and I have my Azure, I have my on-premises, but this time I'm using MPLS. I have an MPLS cloud, so I can have multiple things connected into that cloud. And I have a connection to my MPLS, and over here and over here. Azure basically gets extended into my MPLS cloud. So through my provider, I now have connection into Azure. So again, it's not over the public internet, it's through this, this labeled switching fabric. So there's another way to connect into Azure. And there's different speeds available. Find the right one, here we go. So if I think of exchange providers like the Equinix, I can get up to 10 gigabits per second. So there's that IXP dedicated connection. If I think network service provider, so it's like an AT&T, their MPLS solutions, I can get up to 1 gigabit per second. So the speeds vary, and I think this will change over time. This is kind of like an initial version. But I get very, very high speeds compared to that site-to-site, 100 megabits. And these are kind of more guaranteed. I'm going to get that throughput. I'm not being charged egress and ingress for those connections. And so really that gives me these new options for doing that connectivity between my on-premise and Azure. And no matter which one I choose, if it's the site-to-site VPN, if it's the IXP route, if it's the MPLS route, the key point is really they're just extending my on-premises network into Azure. Just regular IP routing is going to work. So it just helps me sort of bridge that gap and let me run more services in Azure without having to worry about endpoints or anything else. But the key point of this whole thing I wanted to clarify, and it's been a lot of confusion lately, is endpoints of the cloud service, the VIP, is used when I'm accessing it from the internet. Maybe I want to offer a web service out to the internet. I would want an endpoint on the VIP for port 80 that goes to a bunch of VMs. I could do load balancing to port 80. But as soon as I introduce these site-to-site VPNs, internally from my data center, I'm not using those endpoints. It's just direct IP connectivity. I still have the endpoint there, so I can still offer public services if I want to, but I'm not using it for my typical communication. Appreciate you watching this video. Hope it helped. See you again soon. Bye.